William Henry interviews John Lash, Gnostic expert, on an extraordinary breakthrough he has made in understanding the relationship between the Gnostic texts and the UFO presence that has been on our planet for thousands of years, what it means and why they are here. This is not something you will have heard before. John has been on Coast to Coast AM. He goes far beyond at this point where he has been before. Then later, I ask him for our subscribers, are we under Archon attack? Are the Archons the same as the Greys that are discussed so much in UFO literature now? And if so, what does that mean for our future? Now, I'd like you to welcome William Henry. Here's William.
In my 2004 book, Oracle of the Illuminati, lightning struck when I made the connection that the reptilian and gray aliens were known as the Archons by the early Gnostics. It may have been known as the Malachim or messengers by the Sumerians. In books such as The Hypostasis of the Archons, discovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt in 1945, we learn of this group of non-organic, predatory humanoids. Alchemical tradition we've discussed says they envy our divine attributes. We have divine particles. They don't. They want ours. The Archons aim to keep us, quote-unquote, down on the farm, distracted, locked into fear and terror. Why? Because some believe they harvest an energy from us. The vibration of terror is like cosmic cocaine or crack to them. They get off on stupid humans terrorizing one another. Should we worry about the Archons and their plan to terrorize humanity today? In his inaugural speech in 2000, the neocon George W. Bush twice asked, does the angel in the whirlwind still direct the storm? Does the angel in the whirlwind still direct the storm? No one had a clue what he was talking about, but you may recall that Whitley and I broke this down. The angels in the whirlwind are known as the Watchers in the Bible. Our guest today, John Lash, will tell us that the Watchers, the angel perhaps in W's whirlwind, and the Archons are the same. Do the Archons of old direct today's war on terror that ensued immediately after the neocons took power? Blending ancient mythology with modern ufology, John Lash has investigated extensively the Nag Hammadi library and other texts through an ET lens and will help us discover the true nature of our relationship with the Archon Greys and how we can break free of their hold and to connect to a higher divinity of our living cosmos. More importantly, he will talk about Sophia, the Earth's intelligence. John Lash is the author of the forthcoming book, The Once and Future Planet. He writes for metahistory.org, a site sponsored by the Marian Institute. John, welcome to Dreamland.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're thrilled to talk with you, John. As you may have surmised by the introduction, we have tiptoed around and sometimes talked directly about the Archon Grey ET connection, which to me I think is perhaps one of the most important we can make. So where would you like to we examine this question?
Well, I found your synopsis really exciting. It certainly resonates very closely with the research that I've done. I think that we're coming with the addition of this mystery knowledge that comes from the Gnostic teachings and other ancient texts, but primarily from the Gnostics. I think we're getting close to forming a really clear picture of where the Archon ETs play into our reality and how they influence human behavior. So I love the picture that you present, and especially the way that you bring in the Gaian intelligence, because that was certainly an important factor to the Gnostics. So we might start by talking a little bit about their myth of Gaia.
Very good. Yeah, let's start with who the Gnostics were from a basic perspective and open into this idea of the Gaia hypothesis, as it's called, or this Gaia intelligence. So please go ahead.
Certainly. I'll try to sketch that out as concisely as I can. The word Gnostic is really doesn't mean anything particular. It just means kind of specialist or expert, someone who has special expertise in an area, a virtuoso, you might say. And Gnostics were the virtuosos, or the enlightened teachers, if you will, in the ancient pagan mystery schools, which existed in the Far East, in Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, as well as in Egypt and throughout other parts of Europe. And Gnostic, meaning just someone who knows, was just a generic term for these teachers. Now, what's remarkable about these teachers, who were in fact the educators of people in the ancient world, one thing that I might point out is that people in the ancient world, say in pre-Christian times and then in Roman times, were actually quite well educated and literate. They weren't ignorant slaves. There was an intellectual class, and the education of the ancient world was directed by these Gnostics. But they also had a second role, which was that they directed the mystery schools, the universities of spiritual initiation. And coming now back to this concept of Gaia, the figure that we call Gaia today, by which we mean the intelligence of the earth, the living earth as an intelligent being, was known to them as the mythological being Sophia. That's the woman's name, Sophia, but pronounced Sophia. And Sophia was the central figure in their cosmology. The Gnostics did not believe in a father god as such, such as taught in the Bible and in the Judaic Christian tradition, also in Islam. They believed that the most important divinity, not the only one, but the most important divinity for us humans was this Sophia, this earth goddess.
Now, John, one of the problems that we run into when we're trying to understand these mystics, these educators, is that there's very, very few of their actual works that have been presented to the modern world. Let's talk for a moment about the knowledge that they had written down, where it is located today, and what happened to their incredible libraries.
Well, it's a great question and something that we need to really be aware of today, because this is something deeply shocking that has happened. It points to something deeply shocking that has happened in the history of the human race. All the ancient sources that are quite reliable tell us that the Gnostic mystery schools, which were these temples that existed in Egypt and around the Middle East, had libraries. Each one of them had libraries. The most famous one was, of course, the Great Library of Alexandria. We also know that in those libraries there were literally thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of scrolls, of papyrus manuscripts and texts, including cuneiform clay tablets that had come from Babylonia and so forth. And the fact of the matter is, and this is one of the great parts of our history that is very little known, is that all of those writings, almost all of them, were systematically and deliberately destroyed with the rise of Christian religion. And so it would be a fair estimate to say that of the learning and literature of the classical world in Europe and the Middle East, which was extremely rich, less than 10% of the general literature remains, and less than 1/10 of 1% of the esoteric literature remains. It was deliberately destroyed, and we can only ask ourselves, why?
And what would you suggest is the answer to that question, John?
Well, I've reflected very long and hard on that, and from my explorations, particularly of the Nag Hammadi material, the little flake or fragment, of it which has survived, I would guess that these writings were eliminated because they contained information that was essential to the imposition of state religion in the form of Christianity, and essential to the dominator model of civilization that was connected with Christianity and the Emperor Constantine. And because these writings threatened that system, they had to be destroyed. If they had not been destroyed, that system, what we today call Christianity and the political structures that go along with it, as we see, for instance, in the administration of George Bush, would never have come into power.
And so what we had then was this incredible period from about 120 BC to 70 AD, when we have these amazingly intriguing figures like Apollonius of Tyana. We have even the early Christian movement called the Nazarenes or Nasara. But intermixed within them, we have another group that we've talked about recently on Dreamland, a group that called themselves the Zadokим, which are popularly misconstrued as the Essenes.
That's right.
Let's talk for a moment, John, about the role of the Zadokim in this whole scenario and their interaction with these Archon beings.
Well, that's a great question. When we look back at that period of time, and you demarcate it very, very well, about from 150 or 120 BC to 70 AD, when the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, a remarkable thing happened in the Middle East that affected all of Europe. It was a kind of New Age phenomena. I think you could compare it fairly well to that. There was a fever that swept through the land at that time, a kind of messianic madness, and many, many people were expecting messiahs, and many messiahs came forth and declared themselves. As you say, Ananias of Tyana, whom you mentioned, was considered a messiah. John the Baptist was considered by some a messiah truer than Jesus. There were many messiahs competing for the role in that time. And what happened in a very strange way was that one particular Jewish sect called the Zadokим, or the Righteous, became the focal point of this messianic movement. And they formulated an idea of a Messiah that became then the germ of what we now know as the Judeo-Christian religion.
One of the ideas that we've been working on here on Dreamland, John, in conversations with Stephen Mailer, who presented his research concerning Akhenaten, Robert Feather came in and talked about the Zadokim and their allegiance to the past. And
right.
The picture that emerges is that these people, they were a research group of hardcore esoteric researchers. They were looking for specific information, and along the way it appears that they recognized that the human race is in a conflict with another group of beings who are identified in the Nag Hammadi library as the Archons.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it seems like the research that you're doing works on about two tracks. And when we get back from the break here, John, I want to ask you about the connection between this group of sages that we're describing and their ability to expand their spiritual consciousness and to detect the presence of this group of beings called Archons. Mm-hmm. So if you'll think about that during the break, we'll repeat the question.
I certainly will.
Great. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with John Lash. John, just before the break, we were just beginning to talk about this concept of these enlightened beings, if you will, these sagely mystics that included the Zadokim, John the Baptist, and Jesus perhaps in their company, and how they appeared to be retrieving ancient texts that were about expanding their spiritual consciousness. And along the way, this is when they make contact or learn of the presence of this group of beings referred to as Archons. Talk with us for a moment about how these people were expanding their consciousness and how we first began to learn of the existence or presence of the Archons.
Well, I believe that the Gnostics, who were the expert teachers in these pagan mystery schools, were highly trained shamans. They were what we would call today adepts at certain paranormal techniques, such as remote viewing, telepathy, telecognition, lucid dreaming, and things of that sort. That was part of the work that they did in these secret mystery schools, part of the secret work they did. They also did public work in education, as I mentioned. And as a result of a very long tradition, going back certainly to at least 6000 BC, these Gnostic visionaries and seers were able to detect the other dimensional forces that play upon the human race. And so my assumption is, and this is what I argue in all of my writings based on my research, that the Gnostic seers had telepathic skills to detect these entities. Whereas there were other people who lived at the same time, and especially in the period you mentioned, who were not able to detect these entities in the same way. They were more or less possessed by the entities rather than able to detect and resist them. And in that category, I would put this fanatical apocalyptic sect, which is called the Zadokine.
In interviews with George Nuri and Art Bell, you've expressed the idea that the Zadokine may in fact be what we think of today as like a UFO cult, similar to the Branch Dravidians in Waco or even the Heaven's Gate cult.
You know, I have to tell you that I am astonished, and I did not come easily to that conclusion. I resisted making that conclusion. But as you know from my previous interviews, I've studied both the Nag Hammadi material, which comes from Gnostic circles, and the Dead Sea material, which comes from the Zadokine cult, in parallel. And I can tell you that textually and point by point, the evidence is there. The evidence is clearly there. Scholars tend to not see it because a legitimate biblical scholar would be discredited by saying that he recognized evidence of ETs and UFOs. Nonetheless, I have cited passages in the Dead Sea Scrolls that describe UFO activity, and there's no question in my mind that this evidence is there in these ancient documents.
So let's now answer the question directly, John. Who are or what are the Archons?
Well, this goes back to the first subject that we touched on. In order to appreciate the ancient mystery knowledge that was preserved by these Gnostic seers, we need to try to grasp their vision of things. They had a vision, they had a cosmology, a sacred cosmology. And as we recapture and recover that cosmology, we can come to understand the Archons in the context of that cosmology. One of the most remarkable things that comes from the Nag Hammadi research is that the Gnostics said that the goddess Sophia, whom we call the living intelligence of the earth, was actually responsible herself for the appearing of these Archon entities. And, you know, they are called Archons. It comes from a Greek word, a Greek root, archai, which means before or in the beginning. The reason why they're called Archons is because they are an inorganic humanoid species, as you correctly say, that arose actually before the earth was formed and before humanity appeared on the earth. That's why they're called Archons. They were here first. But they were not here on earth because the earth is not their habitat. They were here in the solar system. So this is another thing that the Sophia myth teaches us, is that the Archons are inorganic humanoid entities that inhabit our solar system, but are predatory in relation to life on earth. It's a remarkable picture, and you have to get the whole vision of the Gnostics to see it.
And one of the other points that you make in your writings and your interviews is the possibility that the Archons were originally, in a sense, ejected from the center of our Milky Way galaxy. Talk for a moment, if you would, about the connection between the Archons and the center of our galaxy.
Well, this is a very important point that you raise. As I said before, I believe that the Sophianic vision of the mysteries was a true cosmology, an accurate and genuine cosmology. And if we can kind of reconstruct it in our understanding of astronomy and the galaxy, that would be extremely helpful. 2 points are crucial in this cosmology. One is that they taught that at the core of the galaxy, which they call the pleroma, that it is totally alive, and that is where the gods or divinities live. And Sophia was originally one of the gods or aeons in the pleroma, and it was Sophia who plunged or emanated from the galactic center. That's the first point that they teach in their cosmology. The second point, equally important, is that when she proceeded, you know how the galaxy is structured. There's a hub or center, and then there are the limbs, the circulating limbs. It's like a carousel structure. When the goddess Sophia plunged from the center of the galaxy out into the limbs, created an agitation in that area, which is an area of crude, unrefined atomic matter. It's not alive like the center of the galaxy is. And out of that agitation, arose this Archon species. So they do not really come from the center of the galaxy. They arise due to Sophia's impact outside the center. This is a cosmological picture I'm trying to make here.
And have you given thought to the connection between the Maya 2012 prophecies of our impending alignment with the center of the galaxy and the possibility that there might be an Archon connection between the two?
Absolutely. I'm sure that there's a connection, but I think that it is a human connection and not an Archon connection. I would argue along Gnostic lines that the Archons are precisely one of their activities, one of their effects, is that they interact with our world in such a way to interfere with humanity's connection to the cosmic core. You know, Gnostic cosmology contains it's a beautiful, beautiful cosmological picture, and it contains a key concept which they call the diorthesis, or the correction. And by that they mean that Sophia, the goddess Sophia, who's now the living earth, wants to correct herself by realigning herself to the galactic center. And she needs the intelligence of humanity to help her do that.
Very interesting. That's something that we hadn't considered here before. And so along the way, though, we are getting this interference, and you make the point several times that a key date in terms of the arousal of that interference is 1947. Talk to us a moment about the significance of 1947 and how we are still living in the after effects of that moment.
Well, I think 1947 is probably the year that contains some of the most remarkable synchronicities that any of us have so far considered. I've pointed out in my book that the discovery of the Nag Hammadi text, which exposed the Archons, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are the work of a cult obsessed and possessed by the Archons, appeared at the same time in the summer and fall of 1947. And when you factor that together with the great modern UFO wave that began with Roswell and the Kenneth Arnold sighting in 1947, and then the whole chain of covert government activities dating from 1947, you have a remarkable picture and something that we really need to pay attention to.
Right, and on your site, metahistory.org, which I highly recommend people spend a lot of time going through, on that site you describe the nexus between the Dead Sea Scrolls, the CIA, Roswell, and the reformation of Israel. Can you elaborate on that aspect of it just for a moment?
Yes, that's right, and thank you for commending the site. This is deep material, and a lot of what I have on the site, your readers will recognize, is based on a lot of the known research about UFOs. What perhaps makes the work there a little bit more original, or in some sense, is that I do make this triangulation: Nag Hammadi texts, Dead Sea Scrolls, and then the whole UFO phenomena with the government cover-up. What appears to be one conclusion that we could draw from that is that in 1947, these tremendously important ancient documents came to light through which humanity could learn something about its own problems of the disturbances that we have on Earth, which are largely due to religious conflict. And secondly, that at that very moment, dark forces, that is to say, human beings who are influenced by these archontic beings, went into high gear so that their program would be concealed and they could continue to proceed with their program. So if we understand what happened in that triangulation of 1947, I think we can get a grip on some of the bizarre evil that threatens our world.
In fact, in the Gods of Eden, his book, William Bramley put forth the theory that the three main religions are custodial religions that are nothing more than mind control programs designed to assure conflict. What are your thoughts on that theory, John?
That is absolutely consistent with what the Gnostics warned about the Archons influencing human behavior.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with our guest, John Lash. John, I wanted to ask you that when you're doing your research on the Archons and into these Gnostic texts, which sense would you say is your most powerful ally? I mean, do you have sight, inner sight? Do you hear? Do you have any interactions with the Archons?
Well, you've really popped the question there, and I will say that I have had interactions with the Archons in my life. I certainly have, and they began very early in my life, as they do with many people. And it was only in later years that I was able to put those experiences together and to draw insight from Gnostic teachings and understand what was happening to me. But to answer your question more directly, when I'm writing and researching this material, I rely on two things mainly. I rely on my own experiences, which you could call mystical or paranormal experiences. And many, many people have had these, by the way. I don't think that puts me in any kind of a unique category. Many people have had them. The point is to make sense of these experiences. So I rely on my own first-hand experiences of these entities. And I've also seen UFO hardware as well. But secondly, I would say that I rely more than anything else on my imagination.
And that's something a lot of people don't use in this area. As you've noted, scholars looking at this material are looking, just staring right in their faces, the reality of a ET connection in our ancient past, not only a connection, a reference to it, but also recollections of experiences that we refer today as abductions.
It's astounding, isn't it? It's astounding. It is written so clear that you would have to be a mule not to see it. But you know, scholars, as I said before, have their reputations to protect. But we ordinary people are lucky because we don't have to worry about being discredited, you know, at the university if we admit the reality of these things. And but what we need in order to enter into this phenomena and to master this phenomena and not go into delusion is we need to use the power of our own imaginations. And you know, that's not just my idea. Gnostic teachings themselves tell us that. There's an extremely important word in the Nag Hammadi materials, epinoia, E-P-I-N-O-I-A, and it's sometimes called the luminous epinoia. And that is a faculty that Gnostics teach was implanted in the human race, a faculty of imagination, specifically to help us detect and resist the deviant power of these Archons.
You know, that word, I love that word, epinoia, and the reason why...
Isn't it great?
Yeah, I'm going to Egypt in about a week or so. I'm going to be heading for the Temple of Edfu and looking at the building text there. And it's in those texts that they describe a primordial race that seem to be non-substantial or maybe immaterial, that are led by a being called PN, the letter P, the letter N, whose name is referred to as this one. And every time I look at that name, PN, I'm thinking epinoia. I'm thinking that this is some kind of a thought transmission that comes to Earth and is suddenly embodied in human form. Do you think I'm anywhere close in the ballpark in thinking in those terms?
I think you're very close. You know, I've been to Edfu, and if you go a little further, you know, down the river, you come, of course, to the Temple of Dendera, which is the great temple of the goddess Hathor. And the Temple of Dendera is right across the river from where the Nag Hammadi Gospels were found.
Absolutely.
And you know, the Nag Hammadi Gospels were written in Coptic, and I don't know if many people know this, but Coptic is a very strange language. It's not really a genuine language in certain respects. It's more or less a kind of a shorthand, like a court stenographer would use. And the reason why this shorthand was invented in the first Christian centuries was because people in the Egyptian temple system was declining, and there were no more priests or students who could read those hieroglyphs that you're going to go see at Edfu and elsewhere. They couldn't read them anymore, and there were only a few priests left who could pronounce them, because, you know, hieroglyphs are phonetic. And so they devised a system, these priests, by pronouncing the hieroglyphs and then having those words converted into the Coptic language. It was just used as a translating language, so there's an enormous amount of Egyptian hieroglyphic meaning behind the Coptic language. And I think your intuition about PN is right on the mark.
John, I want to shift gears just for a moment now. I want to tell you a story that comes out of the Testament of Job. Are you familiar with that book?
A bit, yes.
Yeah, the Testament of Job. It's an apocryphal text, and in the story, the patriarch Job is on his deathbed, and he has his daughter go to a secret chamber and retrieve 3 golden boxes that have 3 bands in them, shimmering so that no man could describe their form, is what the story says. And what happens is that the first daughter puts on one of these bands or cords. Next thing she knows, she's out of her body. She puts on a new heart, and she never again cared for earthly things. Then she sang angelic hymns in the language of the angels. The second daughter, and here's the point I want to talk with you about. The second daughter puts on this cord or band, whatever it is. She too goes out of her body. She also has a change of heart, but now she speaks the language of the Archons.
Mm-hmm.
What do you suppose is the language of the Archons?
Well, that would be hard for me to say. This is an interesting story. This is in the Testament of Job. It's an apocryphal Old Testament.
Yeah, and let me relate it to something that I know is very important to you as well as to I wrote a book called The Illuminator about Mary Magdalene.
Right.
Jane Schauberg teaches at the University of Detroit Mercy, and she's a Magdalene scholar, and she notes that the Testament of Job, this story I just noted to you, is part of the mystic literary tradition of Magdala. And what
really?
Yes, and what we are to assume from this, John, is that because Mary Magdalene is associated in the mystic literary tradition with Magdala, that she too must have subsumed these mysteries, which infers to me that maybe Mary Magdalene also knew the language of the Archons or had interactions. What are your thoughts on that possibility?
Well, in the first place, I would say that, again, the Nag Hammadi confirms our research here, confirms the direction you're going in, because, of course, Mary Magdalene figures very strongly in the Gnostic materials, and she's considered to be an illuminated, an enlightened woman, and she's considered to be a seer and a teacher equal with any man. So if she was in the company of those mystery school people, she would have been, of course, able to detect and understand the Archons. I'm thinking about this phrase, the language of the Archons. I'll tell you what that might mean. Possibly. You know, it sounds to me like these 3 rings are versions of what the Egyptians called the menat. And the menat was a necklace that the initiates wore, but only those who wore it, who could do certain chanting techniques and who could communicate in a kind of psychoacoustic way, if you know what I mean.
Interesting, right.
Communicate mantrically with each other. They could communicate telepathically and mantrically. And the menat was the sacred object that only those accomplished seers were able to wear. It sounds to me like these girls are putting on a menat, a version of the menat. Now, what it may mean by the fact that the story says that one of the girls learned how to teach the language of the Archons, the Nag Hammadi texts say that the initiates and the seers in the mysteries were able to talk to the Archons and to confront them with passwords, to know their language. Yeah, passwords. The Archons kind of like to stand in the doorway between our earth world and other dimensions. Now, normally, if we're trained for it in shamanic techniques and if we're properly educated, we can pass back and forth through that doorway, but they would prevent us from doing so. So they represent guardians of the threshold, as it were. And the Gnostic teachings say that the teachers in the mystery schools knew the passwords and the mantras that would get them past the Archons. Maybe that's what the language of the Archons means.
It could be. I mean, I totally would go along with you with that. And then when we pick up the idea from the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, it says that she was given a special transmission of knowledge, or gnosis, that came after Jesus' resurrection, and that this concerned the nature of matter, of salvation, and of the soul's journey through darkness to the astral planes. It must mean that Mary Magdalene knew how to evade the Archon gray ETs.
Well, there's very much evidence of that in the text, even though they're fragmentary. There is very clear evidence that she, especially in a non-Nag Hammadi text called the Pistis Sophia, where she is the main speaker, it describes these levels of the astral world and how to go into those levels and pass through those levels by facing the Archons.
And so we today are, save for those that have had perhaps abduction experiences or have read Whitley Strieber's books, are pretty much clueless about the influence that these beings are continuing to have on us. What knowledge are we to gain while in earthly embodied incarnation that's going to help us to get beyond these figures in the afterlife?
Well, that's a tremendously good question, William, and I think one of the reasons why we're in the dark is because since 1947, there has been a concerted attempt to prevent us from having the survival knowledge that will allow us to place the Archons properly in our own story. And I think that there are two things that are absolutely essential for us to face this planetary menace. One is to know the ancient material and draw what we can from the ancient material. And the second thing is that people who have been abducted and have psychic experiences are obliged by the very nature of those experiences to learn something about psychic self-defense, as Dion Fortune used to call it. And the Nag Hammadi Gospels talk about techniques of psychic self-defense and talk about the learning of mantras and the use of mudras or magical gestures in order to repel the influence of these entities. And by delving into those things and learning those things, we would be in a much, much stronger position to face the reality of this extraterrestrial presence.
And so, just to repeat, John, you've noted that the Archons dwell within our solar system, but they are not part of the Earth. Can we just for a moment reflect on that? And the reason I want to do that, John, is because there's an awful lot going on with the sun right now, as if we're receiving, as some believe, a galactic superwind coming from the center of the galaxy. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the possibility of not only Earth changes as it relates to the Archons, but solar system-wide changes and how that might influence this scenario.
Great question, and very timely one, too, because in addition to the phenomena you mentioned, I'm sure you're also aware that the magnetic field of the Earth itself is now reaching a reversal point. Mm-hmm. And although scientists are able to tell us this is happening, they're unable to say, what it's going to do. I want to point out that this is not something that I'm making up. This is something that comes from the Sophianic cosmology. The Earth is not part of the solar system. It is a planet, a living planet captured in an inorganic system. This is the Gnostic teaching. And you mentioned the sun. Well, one of the episodes in the Sophia story concerns a special relationship that is formed between the sun, which is the central star of our system, and the Earth. And according to that cosmology, the sun and the Earth have a very special biosis between them. As a matter of fact, the sun, the Earth, and the moon, that trinity, really form a single unit. And that unit stands against the other forces in the solar system. So what I would say is if we're having great disturbances in the sun, or perhaps also in the lunar cycles of the moon, it may be because we're reaching a point when there is enormous tension between the trinity of sun, earth, moon, which is a living unit, and the rest of the planetary system, which is an inorganic structure.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with John Lash. John, I wanted to continue our conversation about Sophia and the Pleroma here. I wanted to read a quote from Dane Rudyard's book, The Astrological Mandala. Mm-hmm. He says that what we call mankind is but the long, gradual, arduous, often tragic, and always dangerous transition between the level of quote-unquote life as we know it in the Earth's biosphere, where it operates as a quasi-instinctual and compulsive type of homogeneity, and that of the Pleroma. What are your thoughts on a statement like that?
Well, I think it's remarkable that you're reading Dane Rudyard because he's one of the first great teachers in my life. I never met him.
Oh, wonderful. As well as Mircea Eliade, too. I wanted to know
absolutely,
that.
Yes, right. But Eliade, even before Rudyard, even before Eliade, because I was into astrology when I was quite young, and he was, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest astrologer of the 20th century. Among other things, he was also a cosmologist. In fact, I encountered the word pleroma for the first time in the writings of Dane Rudyard. And I would say that Rudyard's vision is very close in some ways to the Sophianic cosmology. What I get from that wonderful quote is that he's saying that we are part of the biosphere, but we are a part of the biosphere that must become conscious of ourselves in a particular way in order to fulfill our role in relation to Gaia. And Rudyard saw ahead to that vision, and he should be counted among one of the visionaries who put us on this path today.
And this brings us to the point that we're always trying to get at here, John, and that is, what is a fully functioning human being within this biosphere? You know, I mean, we don't have a real target here. And what is the biosphere like when it's really working, when we're really working with it as opposed to seemingly pushing against it?
Well, those are questions that I live with every day. I think those are questions that many of our listeners will respond to with a deep resonance. We carry this question in our hearts, you know. How can we become fully human? I continually raise the issue of what is human potential, what makes us unique, and I'm convinced that we can only discover that by going into a deepening intimacy with the intelligence of the earth itself.
And, you know, one of the things that, and not to throw a downer on this, because we're getting into the kind of subjects I like to talk about too, but I want to bring into this conversation now a statement made by John Lear to Art Bell when he was talking about what we might think of, well, what we do think of as the Greys or Archons. And in this statement, this briefing, as he called it, to Art Bell, he claims that that after the Roswell crash in '47, that the government was unable to find out what the Archons experiment is all about, except to say that the human body has been externally altered or corrected more than 60 times.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't it seem that right now we're in the process right now of redesigning the human body, what through nanotechnology, through genetics, through neuroscience, and they talk about us as containers. Mm-hmm. And there's been speculation, according to Lear, that the souls our bodies contain is the reason for the appearance of the Archons. How do we relate that to this whole idea of human improvement, if you will, and reaching our full potential, but also having to strike this balance now with this incredible new panoply of technology we have at our disposal?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that if I'll tell you, it's a vast subject you open up here, and I can only give you my best guess, which is an inference from my work with the Gnostic teachings. Gnostics use this term. It's a Coptic word, actually, Hal, H-A-L, and it means simulation. Mm-hmm. And they claim that many of the things that the Archons do are really just simulated. They're not real. And they warn us against this techniques and this technology of simulation. And so, getting back to the luminous epinoia, the Gnostics made it very clear that if we were able to cultivate the luminous epinoia, which is the divine element in human potential, we would be on a path toward realizing what humanity is and finding humanity's role with Gaia in the cosmos. But if we are lured to simulated solutions, if we are lured into a technology of make-believe, which is what they attributed to the Archons, then we will in fact fail to realize our true potential. So I see that perhaps the most important insight to come out of Gnosticism is to discern the difference between what really enhances human potential and what gives us a make-believe or simulated version of humanity.
And, as I was reflecting on what Lear had said, I could think back to only one instance where I know that the human body was externally corrected, and that was with the invention of eyeglasses.
That's right.
And the important thing about the invention of eyeglasses was that along with it came the idea that the human body is in fact improvable. That's
right.
That we don't have to stick with whatever genetics gave us. And the reason I bring this up, John, is because in perusing your site on metahistory.org, you had written an article almost as what was a throwaway line, but what seemed to me to be tremendously important, and that was the revelation during this time period we talked about earlier, from 150 BC to 70 AD, the revelation of the idea of the precession of the equinoxes.
Yes.
In the few moments we have left here, can you talk with us about why that was so important and relate it to this moment here where the Maya tell us that we're coming to a close of a 26,000-year precessional cycle?
Sure. The revelation of the precession of the equinoxes around 150 BC by Hipparchus was a tremendous jolt in the ancient world. Why is that so? Mainly because, first of all, the knowledge of the precession of the equinoxes had been a secret doctrine that was known to the initiates in the mysteries for many thousands of years. And it was not allowed to be told to the public for a particular reason. And that reason was that it could be misinterpreted very easily to mean that that anyone who wanted to could change their destiny or could do anything that they wanted. And according to the ancient view of the world, this is not the case. We all have a role to play in the pattern of society and in the pattern of Gaia's life activity. And so when the news came out about the precession of the equinoxes, when it became a popular idea, it was distorted into this notion of individual salvation, freedom of destiny, a kind of narcissism. It fed a kind of narcissism at that time, as I've explained in some of my writings. And that was one of the things that led to this whole messianic fever at the birth of the dawn of the Christian age. So we now today have to take a much more sober view of what the precession of the equinoxes means. It means, I think, that there is a cosmic agenda, a timing that we need to know in order to synchronize ourselves with the planetary intelligence.
And that appears to be the time frame that we're in right now.
We're in a moment of opportunity, absolutely extraordinary. I don't consider the Maya end date to be an end date as such. I consider it to be the date of a window of opportunity.
Mm-hmm. And so, from your understanding of the Gnostic texts and all your other incredible work, what is the best approach during these times for individual seekers who are listening to this show?
Well, I consider the best approach to be to get in touch with the Earth, to realize that no matter what extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional entities may be playing on us, we live in the biosphere. And we have to understand our place in the cosmos by our connection to the living planet, to the Mother Earth. And so the first thing that I would urge is that everyone foster that connection in their own lives, that everyone spend some time to be in communion with nature, whether it be just taking a walk in the woods, going on a wilderness retreat, or whatever. And secondly, something that enhances that connection so much, to understand this Sophianic vision of the cosmos, to know the story of Gaia, and to see how we fit into her story. To me, that is the most hopeful prospect that we have in this extraordinary moment.
John, tell us about what we can expect to see when the Once and Future Planet is available, and also let us know who and what the Marian Institute is as well.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. We're still debating the title on my book. I'm not sure if it'll be the Once and Future Planet, but you can check. Chelsea Green is the publisher. They are very well known for their ecological work. And since the Gnostic vision of Sophia relates very close to ecology, it's kind of a sacred ecology, actually, they have chosen to publish this book. What you'll find in the book is an explanation of how the ancient mysteries of the pagan world, which were suppressed by Christianity, and I tell a little bit about how that happened and about the Zedekim, how these ancient mysteries contain the clues to a sacred ecology for today and to a sustainable future on Earth. So that's what my book is intended to show. As for the Marian Institute, this is a wonderful organization. located on Cape Cod near Boston. It's Marion, because that's the name of the town. And you can find it at marioninstitute.org. It's an organization I've had the honor to be associated with for 5 or 6 years now. And they support many ways to connect for change and to build a better society and a more sustainable future.
Yeah. John, it's like you've kind of come out of nowhere here on the run. I was so impressed with your first interview with Art Bell and your follow-up with George Nuri. We're thrilled that you have taken the time to bring your wonderful insight and energy here to Dreamland. And we hope to have you back again when your book is available. What's in the next on the horizon for you, John?
Well, I'm continuing to develop the site. It is a teaching site, so as you said, as you advised to your readers, and that was wise of you, it does take some time to read the material and study it. I just want to be now more in communication about the question of what is really divine in us, what our relationship to divinity is. These are questions that have troubled me all my life. And to be of whatever service I can with the things that I've learned, and to share and exchange those with other people who are heading in the same direction.
And again, John's site is metahistory.org, metahistory.org. And once again, John, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll look forward to talking with you again.